Dark Souls. Obviously one of the greatest games of all time, known for its brutal difficulty, deep and cryptic lore, and experience like no other. This now 14-year-old game has captured the hearts of millions across the world and has influenced so many games after it, creating its own genre. But with such an amazing game, there are so many mysteries that surround it. From popular fan theories to extremely obscure lore, this game is no short of mysteries. As someone who 100% every Dark Souls game, today's video, I'll be going over to Dark Souls Iceberg. But before we start, I'm guessing you guys already know how Iceberg video works. But for this one in particular, I'll be using PTS4815's Iceberg from Reddit in this video, and I'll be adding some of my own entries on it as well. And for some of the entries on this Iceberg, I'll be using Dark Souls' message ratings in order to rank the truthfulness of the entries. Entries with friend means it's true/confirmed. The Dark Moon Nights means it's heavily implied to be true. Domino means it could be true, but lacks the evidence to rank it higher. Slur means it's headcanon. It lacks any sufficient evidence, but it's fun to speculate. And finally, the Hollow means it's false/debunked. And although this chart will mainly be going over the original Dark Souls, I'll be bringing up the other games as reference points for some of these entries. Now, with all that out of the way, let's dive straight into this. Basilisk Eyes. This is pretty well known by now, but the eyes of the basilisk are not the huge ones on top of its head, but rather the smaller ones found at the sides of its head. This is a pretty similar technique used by real life animals in order to scare off predators, although not as goofy looking. Age of Dark ending. This is the second alternative ending to Dark Souls, where after defeating Gwyn and refusing to link the first flame, you can instead walk outside of this arena and start the Age of Dark ending, where your character is greeted by primordial serpents bound before you as the new Dark Lord. Now, ever since the game's release, this has sparked numerous discussions on which ending of Dark Souls is truly good. On one hand, if you link the fire, you keep the world from fading to darkness. However, you're prolonging the pain and suffering the world is facing. On the other, if you refuse to link the first flame, you cast the world into darkness and become its new ruler. This may seem like a good choice, since Darkstalker Kopf speaks of the Age of Dark as the Age of Man, where humanity will prosper. But if you take a good look at the city of Ulasil, you'll see what darkness does to humans, as it twisted and corrupted Ulasil's residents into deformed monsters. However you look at it, both endings are not truly good. They both bring their own consequences, and it's up to the player to decide which one is the best to choose. In my opinion, if the world's going to get plunged into darkness, might as well be the ruler of it. Killing bosses from outside their arenas. There's actually a couple bosses you can kill from outside their arena. The most well-known example is the one shown here for Manus, since all you need to do is look down the sledge near his fog wall and start firing arrows at him, making what would be a pretty difficult fight trivial. Using Four Kings' sword. Deep within Dark Souls' code, the sword that the Four Kings used was supposed to be able to be attained by the player. This was most likely supposed to be attained through upgrading with the giant blacksmith, just like the rest of the boss weapons. But this was most likely scrapped since the Soul of Four Kings drop can only be used with the Lord vessel, and the devs probably couldn't find an appropriate place to put it, meaning the only way you can use it is through mods like the clip shown in the background. Sith alternate cutscene. If you play through the DLC without killing Sith, you can actually find him in the Abyss. If you approach him, he'll raise his head and howl and teleport away, leaving behind a great shield Artorias left to protect him. He can then later be summoned to help fight Manus. After the DLC concludes, when you fight Sith, instead of immediately attacking, he'll sit the player and start to whimper, recognizing them. After he howls, he'll slowly approach his greatsword. Although he recognizes the player as the one he saved him years ago, he still wants to protect his master's grave at all costs, and then the rest of the fight plays out as usual. I love this cutscene, as it just makes the story of Artorias and Sif even more tragic. Especially as an animal lover, hearing Sif whimper always makes my heart melt. Saving Solaire. When you meet Solaire after the Centipede demon fight, he will sit next to a bonfire in despair, as he has yet to find the son he's looking for. Sadly, you'll later find him in Demon Ruins, where he madly proclaims how he found his very own son, while being taken over by the parasitic sunlight maggot. Thankfully, there is a way to avoid this tragic end to everyone's favorite Sunbro. If you offer 30 humanity to the fair lady, you'll get access to a shortcut through the Demon Ruins. Once the door opens, kill the parasites on the other side, and Slayer will now be saved, and will be able to be summoned when you fight Gwyn. Petrus is a traitor. When you first meet Petrus, he seems like a nice guy who can teach a player miracles, although he prefers to keep to himself as he waits his party to arrive. After the Capra Demon fight, you'll see his parties arrive at Firelink, where Petrus says he'll be departing soon to the Catacombs in search of the Rite of Kindling. After some time has passed, you'll see Petrus back at Firelink. He claims to have been separated from Rhea and her party, and blames himself for his failure to protect her. However, if you speak to Lord Trek, he'll reveal Petrus left her to die in the Catacombs. When you do make it through the Catacombs, you'll find Rhea and her bodyguards, who have gone hollow. After defeating them rescuing Rhea, she'll move to the Undead Parish, and she'll feel guilt for being weak and understand why Petrus left her. When you confront Petrus, he'll be upset with the player for saving Rhea, and saying she's only worth her family's name. If you keep Petrus alive, he'll end up killing Rhea, but if you kill him in his Grey Eclipse haircut before or after rescuing her, then Rhea will be saved. Petrus is a pretty interesting character. He's one of the first NPCs we meet and seems like a nice person on the surface, but deep down, he's a sadistic coward who let the people he was supposed to protect for dead, with even characters like Petrus and Lautrec not even liking him. Oh, and one more thing, if you buy all of Rhea's miracles, she'll get kidnapped and turned hollow in Duke's archives. So if you want to keep her safe, don't buy all of her miracles. Smo kills Ornstein. If you defeat Ornstein first, then Smo smashes his body and absorbs his powers, becoming more powerful. But if you zoom in on Ornstein, you'll see his hands still twitching, meaning he's still alive before Smo kills him. Compared to how Ornstein absorbs Smo's powers, it's shocking how Smo murders his comrade without hesitation. Although it's stated how much of a sadistic character Smo is, there is a theory as to why he shows no hesitation towards Ornstein, which we'll discuss later down in Iceberg. Undead King Jareel. Deep within Dark Souls' files lies a cut boss by the file name Hoshio Jareel, or roughly translated from Japanese as Undead King Jareel. What makes it so fascinating is how close he was to being finished, as it has a full, albeit rough model, unique animations, and audio from old King Olaf from Demon Souls, likely as a placeholder. And thanks to the modding community, we can now see what this boss could have been. But if this boss was so close to completion, then why was he cut from the game? There's been numerous theories and speculations throughout the years. One of them suggests that Jareel was involved in a cut quest of Ingward, in which Ingward tasks the player in killing a Dark Wraith on top of a roof to see if the player is worthy of unlocking the floodgates to the Four Kings. Although a Dark Wraith refers to only serves Koth, not just the enemies, the quest code shows ID data just a generic Dark Wraith, not our Undead King. But the most likely, and my favorite theory, is Undead King Jareel is supposed to be the original boss of New Lundo. This theory is supported by both Jareel and the Four Kings sharing very similar file names, as the Four Kings are listed as Jareel Demon. And based on how Jareel's armor is very jagged similar to the Four Kings, these two could have been part of a two-stage boss fight, where halfway through Jareel turns into one of the Four Kings as a second form. But during development, Jareel is likely cut in favor of the Four Kings instead. Sadly, since this boss was scrapped during development, we'll likely never know who Undead King Jareel was truly supposed to be. 2 Sanctuary Guardians. We all know about the Sanctuary Guardian, the first boss we encountered in Artorias DLC, but after defeating Artorias, if you go back to its arena, you can find 2 Sanctuary Guardians in the original's place. Although these 2 are weaker than the actual Guardian, they're a lot more of a pain in the ass to take out compared to the original, because they can either rush you at the same time, or have one sit in the back firing lightning at you while the other rushes you down. Sadly, these guys don't drop as many souls as the original, but you can't farm these guys for a tail whip if you miss on your first run, but in all honesty, I don't think it's even worth finding these guys for. Ash Lake Hydra Jump.
And look at Randy Orton slithering.
Watch out, watch out, watch out, watch out!
Iron Golem made from Dragon Bone. The core that powers Iron Golem isn't created from magic or some kind of sorcery, but instead of bones of an ancient dragon. If you read the core of an Iron Golem item description, it states that it was originally a bone of an everlasting dragon. This is further explained by the Golem's boss weapon, the Dragon Bone Fist, where the item description reads, "The gods fused the power of a soul with the great bones of the dragons, forming an appropriate core for the giant golem." I have a personal theory that Steve took some part in the creation of the core, as Dragon Bones being used to animate a golem could help his research in defying immortality through the remains of dragons, or bringing the ancient dragons back to life. Critical item chest. At some point, we'll all come across an open chest in Firelink, but never understood why it was there. As it turns out, the chest was supposed to be a failsafe. If for some reason we were to drop a key item such as the Lord Vessel or the White Sign Soapstone, then the chest will have our key item drop in it, as a way to prevent us from soft locking our game. But since you need third-party tools or exploits in order to drop key items, that explains why the chest will always remain open. Humanity is pieces of the Dark Soul. In Dark Souls' intro, it shows the main 3 lords acquiring their respective Lord Souls, but the third pygmy, the ancestor of humanity, acquired a 4th, unique soul. The Dark Soul. What makes the Dark Soul so different from the other Lord Souls is that, say when Gwyn chooses to split apart his soul and give it to someone else, Gwyn's original soul becomes weaker in separation, even more so as the fire fades and the age of dark slowly approaches. With the Dark Soul, however, the third pygmy split amongst humanity, and instead of growing weaker in strength, as humanity began to reproduce and grow in population, the Dark Soul found in every human grew stronger, and even more so as the fire fades. Gwyn, fearing the ever-growing power of the dark, branded humanity with a dark sign that cuts off humans from their immortality and power of their Dark Soul. The standard human form we are familiar with is the dark sign suppressed in the Dark Soul, but as the fire fades, the strength of the dark sign weakens. The undead curse began affecting humanity and turning those inflicted hollow, but in reality, with the weakened dark sign, humans who are inflicted with the undead curse are actually having their immortality returned back to them. And undead who eventually turn hollow are in reality returning back to the true human form. All this works in Gwyn's favor, as when he sacrificed himself to link the first flame, the gods created an undead prophecy in order to convince now undead humans to seek out the first flame and link it in order to break the undead curse. In reality, linking the fire only delays the inevitable, and as soon as it fades once again, the dark side will weaken and humanity will begin to hollow. Now, with all that context out of the way, we now know how the Humanity Island truly works. As when we pop Humanity, it grants us full HP, because we're taking a little piece of the Dark Soul and strength for our own. But if we take that humanity to a bonfire, we are burning that excess amount of our Dark Soul and set strength for our Dark Sign, and reversing our hollowing. Now, with all that being said, I think it's about time to make our way to Layer 2. Vagrants. If you play the original Dark Souls while connected online, you have a rare chance to run into a Vagrant. These egg-shaped crab-like enemies spawn in a random player's world if a player from a different world dies with 5 or more humanity without pick up their bloodstain. When killed, Vagrants always drop humanity, but there are 2 other versions of the Vagrant. A rare red version spawns when a normal Vagrant spawn in 20 different worlds without being killed. They have increased stats and drop a twin humanity instead of a normal one when killed. Lastly, there's the good Vagrant. These little guys are non-hostile and run away from the player and disappear just like crystal lizards do. A good Vagrant spawns when another player drops a specific set of items from their inventory, and said item doesn't get picked up by any other player 10 times. When killed, they have a chance to drop a random list of items, and just like the standard Vagrants, if a good Vagrant spawns in 20 different worlds without being killed, they'll turn red and drop better loot when killed. Vagrants are a pretty interesting concept, but sadly as Dark Souls gets older, the chance to run into a Vagrant decreases, as the number of people playing the original Dark Souls or its remaster goes down each year. Blighttown Wheel Dog. This is pretty well known by now, but in Blighttown, if you look close at the wheel powering the elevator, you can see a dog walking in the center of it. This is a pretty funny Easter egg, but Peoria asks, no, you can't kill a dog using arrows or magic because there's an invisible wall surrounding them. And if you kill a dog with console commands, the wheel doesn't stop moving. Sweet spots. Weapons such as hammers and halberds have a sweet spot range, where they deal more damage if you hit an enemy with the end of the weapon, and less damage the closer you are to them. If this sounds familiar, that's because the sweet spot mechanic was carried over to Dark Souls 2, where it became more fleshed out. Manus is the pygmy. Ever since the Artorias DLC came out, people have theorized that Manus is actually the third pygmy, the ancestor of humanity. And although the game doesn't outright confirm he is, there's a ton of evidence supporting this theory. Firstly, Manus is said to be a primeval man who was buried in the town of Ulasil. Manus being a very ancient human does line up with him being a pygmy. Secondly, if we take a look at Manus' grave, we can see rocky mounds surrounding it, and similar to our own ancestors, this tells us Manus was of great importance when he died, perhaps because he was the pygmy? Thirdly, his boss was described as a lump of humanity, with one being visible in the center of it. Interestingly, the edges of his soul look like tiny pieces of humanity splitting off. Combine this with the humanity enemies we find in Abyss Chasm, Manus' soul could be the original pieces of the Dark Soul splitting off and multiplying. Lastly, Manus has Father of the Abyss as part of his name. Could this just be a title for unleashing the Abyss upon Ulasil? Or could this mean he's the third of Pygmy, the true Father of the Abyss? With all that being said, there's a good counter argument to this theory, that Manus could have been a Pygmy Lord. In case you don't know, in Dark Souls 3's DLC to Ring City, we are introduced to the Pygmy Lords, humans who ruled a human-populated Ring City that inherited large shares of the Dark Soul from the third Pygmy. If Manus isn't the third Pygmy, then he could have been one of the Pygmy Lords tasked to rule over the human town of Ulasil. Although I personally believe Mance is the third Pygmy, it's ultimately up to the player to decide who Mance truly is. Third Pygmy or not, Mance is still one of the most fascinating bosses in Dark Souls. Nito's Grab. I sadly couldn't get footage of this, but Nito actually has a pretty rare grab attack. If you stay in front of him, there's a chance his hand will start to glow, where he'll then grab the player and attack. Personally, Nito is already a pain in the ass to fight, so I'm pretty happy he rarely uses this attack. Shooting Calameet's Eye. Get ready for the next few entries because they're all related to Calameet. But anyways, if you have the skill to pull it off, you can shoot Calameet in his eye and cause him to stagger, giving him a chance to get a couple hits in before he recovers. Speak of his eye, Calameet is not a Cyclops. Despite having a giant red eye on top of his head, Calameet actually has a normal set of eyes at the side of his head. People often mistake him for a Cyclops because how tiny his actual eyes are. Calameet's original skin. Calameet, despite being almost completely black, does have spots on his body that are more lightly colored. People speculate that Calameet gets his dark skin from being corrupted by the Abyss. Its flames also have a dark center to them, and they deal both magic and physical damage, just like dark magic does. Just like Artorias, it looks like Calameet has also fallen to the Abyss. Goth Hidden Dialogue. Okay, I promised this last Calameet entry for a little bit, but this is too cool not to share. Anyways, the intended way to fight Calameet is to have Goth cripple his wings for us, but, although very difficult, if you defeat Calameet while he's still able to fly, you get special dialogue from Goth.
I see that thou hast dusted the great black dragon Calameet wondrously played. Lord Gwyn's blessing upon thee. I see that there is at least one legend among ye humans. Dear me. That old bat will never fly again.
Never spawn the Hellkite. If you're sick of having to deal with the annoying Hellkite Drake blocking the bridge, you can actually avoid spawning them altogether. The Hellkite spawns when you first arrive at the Undead Berg when he lands on the bridge. But if you start your character with the Master Key and pretty much enter the Undead Berg backwards, through the Valley of the Drakes and Dark Route, the Drake will never spawn. Although, if you do go back to where he spawns, then he'll go back towards the bridge. Artorias and Quelaag cut dialogue. Deep within the files of Dark Souls lies pretty interesting dialogue for Quelaag and Artorias. For Quelaag, her dialogue suggests she could have been the original leader of the Chaos Covenant instead of her sister.
The realm of the creatures of chaos. They accept their banished fate. Go back, lest the flames devour all, and the children of chaos feed upon your charred ashes. Welcome, bringer of meat. The children of chaos are hungry. Give yourself to Quelaag's flame.
But she was likely repurposed to be the boss guarding the second bell instead. And as for Artorias, his dialogue is the most sick, because he actually speaks to the player and begs him to stop the spread of the Abyss. This dialogue could have been used during his boss fight, which I attempted to recreate here.
Whatever thou art, stay away. Soon, I will be consumed by them, by the dark. I beg of thee, the spread of the Abyss must be stopped. All of you, forgive me, for I have availed nothing.
Although I understand why Quelaag's was cut, it would have been awesome if they kept Artorias' dialogue during his boss fight. Dark Souls and Bloodborne, shared universe theory. Ever since Bloodborne came out, people have theorized that Dark Souls and Bloodborne take place in the same universe. This may sound outlandish at first, but there's some good evidence to back this theory up. To start, in the Artorias DLC, we're introduced to Marvelous Chester, and right off the bat, he looks like one of the hunters from Bloodborne. He's tall and dressed in a long leather coat and top hat, instead of armor like any other NPC. Chester mentions to the player he was dragged by Manus to the distant past. However, he doesn't mention how far back he's traveled. But this doesn't end here, because as the Dark Souls series continues, blood becomes more and more prevalent. And this is especially true for Dark Souls 3, as blood is used as a source of power, just like Souls or the Dark would be. The Abyss Watchers shared the blood of the wolf amongst themselves. Sister Fried's blood fueled Father Arendel's flame, and of course, Gale's consumption of the blood of the Dark Soul. And said blood would be used as pigment for a new painted world, and some people even add to the series saying the new painted world is in fact Yharnam. And in Bloodborne, deep within the Chalice dungeons, we can find corpses of knights in armor, just like the ones in Dark Souls. Now, with all this evidence and links between Dark Souls and Bloodborne, do these games actually share the same universe?
No.
Despite how cool the series sounds, Hidetaka Miyazaki, the man behind Dark Souls and Bloodborne, has said multiple times that Bloodborne is unrelated to any other Souls or FromSoft game, and even without an official statement, we can still pick apart this theory. It's heavily implied in Dark Souls 3 that blood is used as a vessel for souls, and not necessarily the blood itself that grants power. And as for Chester, the Artorias DLC is being worked on right around the same time FromSoft started work on Bloodborne, so Chester's inclusion could have been a fun Easter egg foreshadowing the upcoming Bloodborne. Although the series is considered false, it's still one of the most popular and fun theories in Dark Souls, with some people even saying Demon Souls and Elden Ring are prequels to both these games. However, that's a story for another time. But there's another part to this theory, and it's that Karim is Yharnam. As far as the shared universe theory, people have speculated that Karim is actually an ancient version of Yharnam. To start, the warriors of Karim are said to prefer parrying daggers instead of shields, preferring a more aggressive fighting style, similar to the hunters in Bloodborne. Speaking of blood, Karim is also the land that produced the Blood Bite ring, suggesting Karim had an affinity for bleeding their opponents, to the point where a ring was created in order to protect against blood loss. And lastly, the sniper crossbow is a weapon used by Karim snipers, and who uses it? None other than Chester, of course. Although this does sound interesting, just like the shared universe theory, it's unfortunately false, due to Miyazaki saying Dark Souls and Bloodborne take place in their own separate universes. Solaire links the fire. So the Dark Souls community seems to have its own Mandela effect. A lot of people misremembered or seem to believe that if you save Solaire and summon him to fight Gwyn, he'll link the first flame. Despite how cool this sounds, this is sadly fake. Kind of. Let me explain. When you defeat Gwyn with Solaire, there's no option to let him link the fire, as he disappears after the fight. What people are probably misremembering is a pretty well made edit from Antonius Tertius, where it shows Solaire linking the fire with his Sunlight Maggot dialogue spliced in. Antonius made this when he did a Solaire challenge run a couple years back, and people who've seen this video probably thought it was real, or misremember it being. So Solaire cannot link the first flame, at least not in game. There's an old interview with Miyazaki where he was discussing Solaire. At the end of it, he mentions after being Gwyn, Solaire will proceed to link the first flame in his own world. Although we never got to see it, it looks like Solaire finally found his very own son. Oscar's original quest. During Dark Souls development, Oscar's story originally had its own questline to him. Instead of meeting him while he was dying inside the asylum, he would have met the player after a silent demon fight, and then later on in Darkroot, where he could be summoned to help with Sif. After the fight, he'll tell the player they should go their own separate ways, and focus on their own goals. The player won't encounter Oscar until the final part of the game, where after defeating Gwyn, Oscar would then challenge the player, and depending on which serpent you chose, Oscar would criticize you for choosing the wrong side. After his defeat, you'll then get Gwyn's soul and be able to beat the game. Oscar's questline does sound cool, as he sort of acts like a rival for the player, but I can see why this was cut. It would have been pretty weird to defeat Gwyn and then all of a sudden have to fight an NPC just to beat the game. Plus, the thematic way of Gwyn using the last of his strength to protect the first flame kind of goes away as Oscar storms in to challenge you. Voices in Pinwheel's music. Despite being a complete joke of a boss, Pinwheel is actually one of the creepiest bosses in the game. If you listen real closely to Pinwheel's boss music, you can actually hear faint voices in it. Let's go ahead and take a listen. Someone on Reddit has actually made an effort to decipher what the voices are saying, and the results are eerie. According to their findings, the voices are saying, "I'm so sorry, help me," and some people have even heard, "It's all your fault." This all makes more sense if we take a look at Pinwheel's lore, where it's heavily implied Pinwheel was once a father who tried to use necromancy in order to bring back his wife and child. In the process, all three of them became fused and grafted to each other, becoming Pinwheel. The voices we hear during his boss fight are actually Pinwheel expressing regret for his actions, his child crying out for help, and his wife blame him for what he has done. Great Hollow following Basilisk. Do you ever wonder why you receive 400 souls when entering the Great Hollow? As it turns out, the devs accidentally left a Basilisk out of bounds. Whenever the player enters the Great Hollow, a Basilisk will spawn, but since it's out of bounds, it'll fall into the void to its death. It's unknown why he was placed out there, but it could have been a dev put him out of bounds to delete him, but forgetting to do so and leaving him out there. Cut Bear Armor. Just like the Four King's Sword, the Bear Armor is another piece of cut equipment. Little is known about this armor, as it only exists as a texture in the game's files. Apparently, according to an interview, it was cut due to not matching the aesthetics of the game. And personally I agree, as this armor looks like something you find a bandit or Forsworn wearing in Skyrim. Havel is not the man in the tower. Most Dark Souls players already know this, but the Havel you fight in the tower isn't actually the real Havel. This may sound weird considering he's wearing Havel's set and drops his ring, but if we take a look at the ring's description, it states that his ring is worn by Havel's followers and not the man himself. Furthermore, we can find Havel's armor and equipment in Anor Londo, alongside of a peculiar club, which we'll discuss later on. Anyways, the Havel we find in the tower isn't actually him. This also explains why we run into different Havels throughout the series, since they're all followers of the original one. And for the last entry of the Slayer, Crestfallen Merchant is floating. If you take a look at the Crestfallen Merchant, you can see that he's actually floating. This is pretty funny because it does probably want to make him taller, but it didn't want to change his model, so they made him float a little to make him look bigger. Anyways, floating edgelord aside, it's time to make our way to Layer 3. Drift items. Drift items are what a drop item becomes before it has a chance to evolve into a good vagrant. The list of items vary, but the loot from a drift item is always inferior compared to good vagrants. Shiva and the Chaos Blade. Shiva of the East originally had his own questline to him, involving the Chaos Blade. Originally, if you brought the Chaos Blade to him, he would have killed the player and run off with the sword. Just like Lord Trek in the base game, the player would have to use a Black Eye Orb to invade Shiva's world in Ariamis in order to get the Chaos Blade back. What makes it so interesting is despite this questline getting cut during development, you can still invade Shiva's world. If you jump off these crates before a specific set of inputs, then the game will glitch and allow you to invade Shiva's world, or you can even obtain a souvenir of reprisal when you kill him, just like Lord Trek. Although it's sort of glitch, it's still pretty interesting how we can still access a part of this quest despite it being cut from the game. Undead Prophecy fabricated by Gwendolyn. We already know that the Undead Prophecy was created by the gods to find powerful undead to link the fire, but there's a good chance that Gwendolyn was the mastermind behind the prophecy, as his father Gwyn sacrificed himself to link the fire, and his sister Guinevere fled long ago, leaving Gwendolyn as the last god to reside in Anor Londo. In order to keep the Age of Fire going, he and Kingsleeper Fram likely were the ones to create the Undead Prophecy to find powerful undead to keep the Age of Fire going. Giant Skeleton show off the Murakumo. If you want to acquire the Murakumo without killing Shiva, you can actually farm the giant skeletons for it, although it's a pretty rare drop, as in reportedly 2% drop chance, so on second thought, it's probably better to kill Shiva for it instead. Dust and Sieglin visible in their golems. A pretty neat detail is you can actually see both Dust and Sieglin trapped inside the crystal golems. Velka is punishing the gods. Velka, the Gods of Sin, is one of, if not the most mysterious characters in the whole Dark Souls series. Outside a handful of item descriptions, we basically know nothing about her, but what we can gather is as Goddess of Sin, she punished those who commit sin against the gods, and has worked with Gwendolyn the Blades of the Dark Moon to punish sinners. Now you might be thinking, if the title of the entry is Velka punishing the gods, now comes she was working with them. Well, if we take a look at the spell Vow of Silence, it states that Velka is considered a rogue deity, and that tells us at some point Velka broke off from the main pantheon of Anor Londo, and if he killed the crow demons in the Painted World, who Miyazaki said were originally designed as worshippers of Velka, they have a chance to drop a souvenir of reprisal, an earlobe that the Blades of the Dark Moon would take after killing someone who committed sin against the gods. What this can tell us is that Velka not only had a fallen out with the gods, but her followers and Velka herself were now considered enemies of them. Now, what could have happened to cause the gods to hunt down Velka and her followers? Well, when Gwyn linked the First Flame, he broke the course of nature by artificially prolonging the Age of Fire and preventing the flame naturally dying out and starting the Age of Dark. This act, told us by Aldia, is known as the First Sin. Velka, being the goddess of sin herself, likely turned against the gods for allowing Gwyn to commit a sin against the world itself by linking the First Flame. In response, the gods started persecuting Velka and tasked the Blades of the Dark Moon to hunt down her followers. This probably explains why we have very little information about Velka, as the gods probably tried everything in their power to erase her existence, just like the Nameless King. Now, with all that context, how is Velka punishing the gods? Well, this theory is a stretch, but Velka is most commonly associated with crows, and the giant crow that takes the chosen undead from the asylum to Lordran could have been sent by Velka herself. She likely saw great potential within the chosen undead, and by taking them to Lordran, she is punishing the gods by unleashing a powerful undead upon them that could one day usher in the Age of Dark. Now, whether you believe in Velka helping the main character or not is up to you. Despite only being mentioned in a few item descriptions, Velka is still one of the most interesting characters in Dark Souls. Vamos dialogue mistake. Yeah, if you guys ever talk to Vamos, then you know how his voice sounds off.
Why, you have an ember, do you? Ah, forget about it. I don't deal with that kind. What has gone wrong with embers these days?
I tried to look up why his voice sounds like this, and I can't really get a straight answer. Some say it's a glitch, a compression issue, or just a weird stylistic choice. Funny enough, Famo shares the same actor as Solaire, and as we all know, Solaire sounds perfectly normal. It might be a sound compression bug, but this issue still persists in the remaster. But then again, the remaster neglected to fix a lot of different issues. So who knows what's going on with Famos. Either way, he still sounds like he's talking over a $10 microphone.
All the other players with the diamonds.
Dragon Butt Shortcut and Paint the World. A pretty well-known skip in the Paint the World is if you go up to the dragon legs and perform a jump attack on them, the legs will spring up and allow you to jump down the bridge and get to Priscilla much faster. Apparently the reason why the legs jump up like this is due to how certain attacks work. When you perform a grab attack or a backstab, interrupts the target's animations. And this also applies to the jump attacks, which explains why the dragon jumps up to its default pose like the ones in Iceberg. Priscilla's Soft Lock. A pretty infamous bug within Dark Souls is that if you manage to kill Priscilla before she has a chance to start a boss fight, her death dialogue will start infinitely repeating, and since her dialogue never fully completes, the flag for her dying is never checked by the game, meaning the player has just soft locked their character. There is no way to leave the Paint the World, since all the bonfires are cut off, and jump off the bridge doesn't trigger the cutscene to leave, so the only way out is to start a new character. To this day, this bug has never been patched, even in the remaster. Despite how game-breaking this bug is, it actually grew a cult following amongst some speedrunners. Known as Moan%, people have compete and try to see who can soft-lock their game the fastest. And the name comes from, well, you guys can probably guess. Bed of Chaos Original Skin. What I believe this entry is referring to is the original concept of the Bed of Chaos. In an interview, Miyazaki and other developers said they wanted the Bed of Chaos to be the king of Iceland, where the boss would have looked like he was sitting on his throne. However, Miyazaki and the game's concept artists couldn't agree on design, so the Bed of Chaos was created instead, with Miyazaki knowing it was one of his biggest regrets when making the original Dark Souls. Ancient dragons were not truly alive. An interesting fact about the ancient dragons is that they were not truly alive. According to an interview from Miyazaki, he states that the ancient dragons are half living, half element, which makes sense because the concepts of life and death did not exist before the first flame. The ancient dragons, although technically alive, existed as another part of the world, almost like rocks or minerals. That was all until the first flame appeared, but without covering too much of another entry on this tier, I'll just leave it off here. Fire Sage doesn't use pyromancy. This may sound weird at first, considering a fire sage as well, using fire to attack us. Isn't this pyromancy? Well, no. Instead, he's using flame sorcery. If you look at the demon catalyst the fire sage drops, and the Iceland catalyst, it states that there once existed flame sorcery. Long ago, the Witch of Iceland and her daughters used flame sorceries, but when Iceland attempted to recreate the first flame with her soul, it backfired and consumed the witch, creating the Chaos Flame, which would then spawn both demons and pyromancy. While flame sorceries are powered by souls just like standard sorceries are, pyromancy draws its power from the Chaos Flame. Soon, the art of flame sorcery would die out in favor of pyromancy, leaving the demon sage as the last user of this forgotten art. The ending doesn't matter. When we beat Dark Souls, we are given a choice here to link the fire or let it fade and start the Age of Dark. However, if the other games don't take place in Age of Dark, then does that make the Dark ending non-canon? Not exactly. You see, Dark Souls takes place in a constant cycle of light and dark. The best example of this is in Dark Souls 2, where it said Drain Lake was built upon many different kingdoms that have risen and fallen, and if you choose to link the first flame, the Emerald Herald states how all this will play out again. And eventually, it does. As in Dark Souls 3, we fight against the Lords of Cinder, people who have previously linked the First Flame, and the main character, the Ashen One, was once somebody who attempted to link the fire. So what this tells us is that whether the Chosen Undead in original Dark Souls links the fire or not, doesn't really matter. If they link the fire, then the cycle continues into the other games. But if they choose to walk away from the fire, then someone else will eventually come and link it, whether it will be the Bearer of the Curse, a Lord of Cinder, or an unkindled Ashen One. Parrying armored boars. Strangely enough, the armored boars can actually be parried, although it's pretty difficult since you have to parry them when they're charging at you, but if you pull it off, they'll stagger off to the side and give you the chance to backstab them. Dragons not wiped out. Now, this entry can be taught about two different subjects, but I'm gonna go ahead and discuss both of them. The first being the obvious, Sif is an ancient dragon, although he was born deformed and lacking the moral scales of his brethren. But besides them, the ancient dragons we see in the intro are extinct. However, their descendants still live on throughout the series. Dragons born after the first flame appeared began to mutate and change from their ancient relatives. This is how the Hellkite, Hydra, and Gaping Dragon exist, while older dragons like Calamite, Sin, and Midir bear a close resemblance to their ancient counterparts. But the other thing this could be talked about requires us to take a trip down to Ash Lake. Deep in one of the hollowed out trees, we can find the stone dragon. Now, there's so many different theories regarding this thing. Some people have theorized that it's actually an ancient dragon hatchling that survived the war. However, what we do know is that it's a descendant of the ancient dragons, not a natural one from the intro. Yet, it still shares the same appearance as one, and could even possess the immortal dragon skills of one, due to the player being unable to kill them. Although the ancient dragons might be extinct, just like the dinosaurs in real life, they still live on through their descendants. Crestfallen Merchant Halloween. The Crestfallen Merchant has cut dialogue of him Halloween.
Think, remember. Remember, counts. 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Count. I can't.
It's unknown if this would have been part of a quest, or if he would have started Halloween over the course of the game, but the way he tries to count to 5 reminds me of Lucatile trying to keep herself together from Halloween. Ingrid Original Quest. I already briefly went over this during the Jarrell entry, but Ingrid would have originally tasked the player to kill a Darkfree to see if they're worth unlocking the floodgates to New Lundo. It's unknown why this quest was cut, but it does probably want the player to unlock the floodgates faster without having to do any more extra steps. And finally, for the last entry of this layer, the plot against the gods. If you guys are huge Dark Souls lore nerds like I am, or watch Hawkshaw, then you know what I'm talking about. But for those who don't know, the plot against the gods is one of the deepest pieces of Dark Souls lore. Although this event is only mentioned by a handful of item descriptions, we can still piece together and theorize what truly happened. To start, before the fire began to fade, there was already growing discontent towards the gods, most notably from Havel the Rock. Havel disliked the gods' alliance with Sif the Scaleless, a dragon who Havel and many others fought against during the war, losing hundreds if not thousands of their own men, just for the gods to not only ally themselves with one, but grant full dukedom. Not to mention how Sif uses his newly acquired position to run twisted experiments in the Duke's archives, one of which involved kidnapping women across Lordran to turn into grotesque abominations, in hopes of impregnating them to birth an everlasting dragon. One of these women could have very well been Havel's love interest. This discontent with the gods grew ever more when the fire began to fade, and Gwen, not wanting his age of fire to end, sacrificed himself to the first flame. As previously mentioned, Velka saw Gwen's action as a grave sin and turned against the gods of Anor Londo. Together with likely the support of Velka, Havel started to plot against the gods. He started gathering followers and acquiring occult weapons that would be very effective in taking down the gods, and some of these followers would attempt to steal the riot kindling from Nito to help bolster their strength. However, either through a lack of strength or someone riding out the plotters, the plot against the gods would fail. Havel and his followers were likely executed for the treachery, and any occult weapons were destroyed or stored away in the painted world, alongside any captured followers of Velka, the now rogue deity. Although the gods were successful in crushing this revolt, it ultimately proved futile, because eventually the fire would fade once again, and all the gods of Anor Londo would lose their power and flee, leaving the once powerful city of the gods nothing but an empty husk. Now, this is why I love Dark Souls lore so much, because in any other game, we're already told what happened, either through a journal, audio log, or a computer entry. However, in Dark Souls, the game doesn't outright tell us what happened in game's past. Sure, there's an opening cutscene, but much of the game's history is told to us through NPCs, item descriptions, and environmental storytelling. It's left up to the player to piece together these bits of information to figure out what happened in game's past and come up with our own conclusion. Even something as a weird looking shield or an Our Place Club can tell us a lot about the game's history. Now everyone, it's time to make our way to Layer 4. Blighttown Outdated Firelink Model. A pretty neat detail is that if you look up at the sky in certain parts of Blighttown, you can actually see Firelink. Although, this Firelink uses a low-res model, since the player isn't supposed to see it up close. Nonetheless, it's still a cool detail and adds to the interconnectedness of the world. Miracle Resonance. If you use a miracle while connected online, there's a chance you'll send out a miracle resonance to another player's world. These white circles buff a specific set of miracles when used in its proximity. Similar to the vagrants and drift items, miracle resonance are rare to come by nowadays, due to not many people playing the original Dark Souls anymore. Bell Gargoyle Fall should be survivable. So unfortunately with this entry, I try my best to look up what this is referring to. However, the closer results are reports of gargoyles falling off the roof. So if any of you guys know what this entry is talking about, please let me know in the comments. Backstepping gives infinite poise. For those who don't know, poise determines your resistance against stagger by an attack. The higher the poise, the less likely you'll stagger. And strangely enough, backstepping briefly gives the player infinite poise. It's unknown why it does this, and outside a few uses, backstepping is always inferior compared to just rolling away from an attack. Jeremiah is the king of Islith. Xanthus King Jeremiah is a pretty odd character. Outside the silly hat, he invades us in the painted world and uses pyromancies against us. He seems out of place here, but there's some good evidence that he could have been the king of Islith. Besides him using pyromancies of course, if we take his crown to Snuggly, she gives us a ring of favor and protection. This ring was given to followers of the goddess Fina. And Jeremiah invades us in the painted world, a place the gods store away and banish things that pose a threat to them. So what this can tell us that Jeremiah might have cheated on the Witch of Islith for Fina. Islith, honestly getting pissed over this, banished Jeremiah to the painted world. And if this is true, then Jeremiah dodged a massive bullet. Second gargoyle wounded by Lautrec or Crestfallen Warrior. Some people have theorized that the reason the second gargoyle spawns with only half health is due to being injured by either Lautrec or the Crestfallen Warrior. For Trek, he could have attempted to take on the gargoyles get the Errant Lundo, but failed to do so and was locked up in his cell as a result. However, the most convincing, I believe, is the Crestfallen Warriors. He speaks to the player about the Bells of Awakening, but he mocks the player and doesn't believe they'll actually be able to ring them. It could very well be self-reflecting, due to lacking the strength to ring the bells himself, and his failed attempts could explain why he's crestfallen. This is further reinforced when the player returns to Firelink after ringing both Bells of Awakening to find that once mocking Crestfallen has hollowed. Although this theory is mostly in the headcanon range, it's still fun to think about. Scrap Lowerberg Shortcut. Originally, Firelink was a shortcut connecting where Lautrec now sits to Lower Undead Berg. Some people in the community have even re-added this to the game. However, the shortcut was likely scrapped due to the main bridge to Undead Berg already having a shortcut to the lower section. Seath helped imprison Havel. During the plot against the gods entry, I explained how much beef Havel had against Seath. This entry suggests that Seath took some part in imprisoning Havel in the tower we found him in. Although it's likely Seath helped imprison him, as mentioned in another entry, the Havel we find in the tower isn't the real one. The actual Havel was either executed or fled into exile after the failed plot against the gods, so Seath helping imprison a mere follower of Havel remains uncertain. Gaping Dragon came from Ash Lake. Despite the title of the entry, I couldn't really find any evidence that the Gaping Dragon came from Ash Lake. The closest I can find is potentially where the dragon climbed up from during its cutscene. It's heavily implied Seath is guarding the dragon because one of his channelers is watching over its arena. However, it's unknown if he discovered the dragon in Ash Lake, or if Seath even knows about Ash Lake at all. Black Knights meant to roam the world. Originally, the Black Knights were supposed to roam across the map. However, either through technical or balancing difficulties, they instead became stationary. And I'm glad they did, because it would have been a pain to find my way through an area just for a Black Knight to show up out of nowhere. Cragspire Egg Attack. If you stand behind the Cragspires in Blighttown, they have a chance to drop these fire eggs from their tail, and they can do a heavy amount of damage if you're not careful. Luckily, you won't have to worry about the stack since you'll most likely be one-shotting them anyways. Velka is the only true deity. We already discussed Velka, now she became a rogue deity, but she could very well be one of the last gods who still holds on to their power. Throughout the game, all the other gods either fled or lost most of their original powers, leaving Velka as the last one of any sort of influence, and some have even theorized that Velka helped found the stable church of Lundor. However, that's a discussion for whenever I get to Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls comics. Yeah, you heard that right. Dark Souls actually has some official comics made for it. Made from 2014 and 2018. There are 6 comics that tell their each non-canon stories, with most of them revolving around Dark Souls 2. Now, the real question is, are any of these comics actually good?
No.
Yeah, unfortunately a lot of these comics suffer from bad writing, out-of-place cameos, and really bad art. Seriously, this looks like AI slop, but it was made in 2016. And stories that don't really feel like it has anything to do with Dark Souls, are just generic fantasy stories. However, despite that, there are a few stories that have really well done artwork, and one of the comics is actually pretty decent. Known as the Age of Fire, it follows the story of one of Gwen's knights named Archon, who fought during the war against the dragons, became a Black Knight when fighting against the demons, and later on became one of the Black Knights guarding the Undead Asylum. It's a pretty neat story and has cameos from other characters that make sense and helps flesh out the story. If you're interested in learning more about the comics, I recommend you watch Edward Rigby's video on them. He did an amazing job covering them, and I'll leave his video in the description. Now, despite the comics being pretty bad, I wish they could have made novels covering the game's lore, like Halo and Gears of War did. Because Dark Souls lore is so rich, a novel covering, say, the plot against the gods or Gwen's rise to power would have made an excellent read. And now for the final entry of Layer 4, Nameless Blacksmith Deity. The Nameless Blacksmith Deity is a mysterious character only mentioned in the Titanite descriptions. This character is even more scared than even Velka in the plot against the gods. But what we do know of them is that they're a blacksmith for the gods and created the Titanite slabs, powerful materials that can turn a weapon into something legendary. However, the blacksmith would pass away to unknown circumstances, and after her death, Titanite demons begin to emerge from the Titanite slabs, roaming across Lordran, infused with the power of the slabs. During the events of the game, we can only really find Titanite shards, with the Titanite chunks only being a recent rediscovery, and the once powerful Titanite slabs being so rare that their existence is considered a myth. There's a couple of theories on who the blacksmith was. One of them suggests they were called the Nameless Blacksmith Deity, just like how Gwen's firstborn son is the Nameless King. The blacksmith could have done something to upset the gods to where their name was erased from history. Another popular theory is that the blacksmith could be Vamos. Both of them are blacksmiths. Vamos is located near the Tomb of the Giants, where the gods were put to rest, and Vamos drops a helmet that's from a royal line. But whoever the blacksmith deity was will likely remain a mystery. Despite that, his presence still felt throughout the game, as he used his very own creations to upgrade our equipment. Now, with all that covered, it's time to make our way to Layer 5. Item burn still in game. Unlike in Demon Souls, Dark Souls doesn't have an item burn limit. At least not a visible one. You see, Dark Souls still has an item limit of 10,000. The devs need to put some kind of limitation on how much the player can pick up without running into memory issues. So they decided to put at a number most players would likely never reach during a normal playthrough. However, because of this limitation, people have figured out how to duplicate items using it. Without going too much into detail, if you collect over 1,000 of the same item, usually from buying the same weapon over and over from Andre, and perform a bunch of other specific inputs, any item you drop afterwards will duplicate, including Titanite slabs, boss souls, and covenant items, making the grind for these items much easier, if you're willing to glitch the game out for them. Changing server item description. If you infuse the server greatsword with the fire or chaos enchantments, it'll change its item description from imbued with a frightful occult energy to imbued with a frightful heretical energy. This is a pretty neat detail, and as far as I know, this is the only item that changes its description when you upgrade it. Griggs is an assassin. When we first meet Griggs of Venheim, he tells us he came to Lordran to search for legendary sorcerer Big Cat Logan. When we eventually find and free Logan from Sin's fortress, Griggs is ecstatic to finally meet the legendary sorcerer. However, Griggs' attentions are put into question, because when we find him hollowed in Sin's fortress, he's next to a corpse with the sorcery Hush, a spell that masks the sound of the user, alongside the Black Sorcerer set, an outfit that Griggs himself wears that is worn for stealth purposes. What these items can tell us that Griggs could have been sent by the Dragon School of Venheim to either spy on Big Cat Logan, or possibly even assassinate him. Griggs only halls in Sin's fortress after Logan has already left for the Duke's archives, so Griggs might have gone to Sin's fortress to prevent Logan from reaching the archives and uncovering the twisted secrets it holds. Bed of Chaos Fireballs. Just like Neo's grab in Layer 2, the Bed of Chaos has a very rare attack. There's a chance it can shoot fireballs from its torso. However, most players probably won't see this move because of, well...
No, fucking Jesus.
Bonus damage only affects individual kings. If you say poison when finding the 4 kings, the king you poison will only affect that one individual king, and not the others. Primordial Crystal made to help Seath. Seath the Scales is born without the immortal scales of his ancient dragon brethren. However, Seath discovered something, although fragile, that could grant him immortality, the Primordial Crystal. It's unknown where this crystal came from, but as the title of the entry suggests, the crystal could have been made for Seath by the dragons to allow him to become immortal. However, it's said Sif pillaged the crystal from the dragons when he turned against them, so the chances of the crystal being made for him is unlikely. Nonetheless, Sif attaining the crystal didn't stop his desire to attain true immortality by any means necessary, whether it be kidnapping women, experimenting on innocent people, or helping to bring his own kin to extinction. Jeremiah and the Wallhugger connections. The parasitic Wallhugger we find in Blighttown seems pretty out of place here. It just sits over this wall and guards the spell of power within. But if we look in the game's files, the Wallhugger is named Prince Islif. To add on to this, the Wallhugger's appearance bears a resemblance to Jeremiah's headpiece. So could this odd enemy be Jeremiah, or one of Islif's sons? Sadly, we only have those pieces of evidence to go off of, and the identity of this thing will likely remain a mystery. Deflecting boulders with force. If you time it just right, you can actually deflect the boulders the giant throws at you at Sin's Fortress. The corpse with a sack on its head. In the Undead Asylum, there's a hollow's corpse lodged into the metal bars as a sack on its head. As far as I know, this is only hollowed as any sort of headwear on. I do have a pretty funny theory that this dude put a sack over his head trying to sneak past a stray demon, but got slammed against the wall instead. Probably because he can't rock the sack like I do. Spawning Quelana without plus 10 flame. You don't actually have to upgrade your Pyromancy Flame of Florentius in order to spawn Quelana. If you're invaded by or selling someone that has a plus 10 Pyromancy Flame, then that person will trigger Quelana to spawn, without you actually having to upgrade your Pyromancy. Centipede Demon originally guarded the first bell. For this entry, the only thing I can find mentioned as Centipede Demon guarding the first bell is a Reddit post mentioning it was cut content. I spent over an hour trying to figure out where this claim comes from, but to no avail. Same with the gargoyles. If you guys have any info about this, please let me know in the comments. Unused Stone Dragon animations. In the game's files, the Stone Dragon has a couple of cut animations. Most of them are attack and death animations if the dragon wants to be aggroed. However, there's this weird animation where he flies up while keeping his legs crossed, just to turn around. Speaking of his legs, this might explain why the Way of the Dragon emote has the user sit with their legs crossed, probably to sit just like the Stone Dragon does. Crag spires were people. Despite looking like deformed insects, the crag spires were originally people. Above his mouth, you can actually make out what used to be a human head. And to add on to this, there's a cut enemy of a hollow in the middle of transforming into one. If this enemy looks familiar, it's because they re-added him in Dark Souls 2 with all the spires in Seldora. Domhole is stalking the player. Domhole is Zena, maybe just a humble merchant on the surface, who gives helpful tips to the player. But he does have items that no other vendor sells, such as boss gear. Where does Domhole get all these things from? Well, there's a theory that suggests Domhole might be stalking the player and pillaging the corpses of defeated bosses for their equipment to sell back to the player. This also explains why he gives out tips to make it easier for the player to clear out areas so Domhole can swoop in and loot what's left. Although it's just a theory, it does explain why Domhole sells such unique equipment. Destroy bridge to Havel's Tower. If you look on the outside of the tower Havel is in, you can see the ruins of what used to be a bridge connecting to his tower. Now, this bridge might have fallen apart due to the passage of time, or it might have been intentionally sabotaged to keep Havel from escaping. Calamite backflip. Calamite has a very rare chance to do a backflip. Yeah, that's it. Wolf ring found on Chester's corpse. The corpse we find the wolf ring on could be Chester's. When we speak to Karan after defeating Artorias while having the wolf ring equipped, she'll mention how the ring was stolen by Chester and ask you to return it back to her. And the course we find the ring on is in Darkroot, which is modern day Ulasil, the place we meet Chester in. So this corpse could be Chester's. Now everyone, it's time to make our way to Lair 6. Flame God Flan. Flame God Flan is yet another obscure character that has very little information about them. However, what we do know of them is that they're worshipped as a god of flame by humans and married Guinevere. However, when the fire began to fade, Flan, Guinevere, and all his old other gods and Orlando would leave the sacred city. What happened to Flame God Flan afterwards is a mystery. However, people have theorized that Flan and Guinevere would help create Hyde's Tower of Flame, a now ruined kingdom that bears many similarities to the old city of Orlando. And the dancer of the Boreal Valley could be a direct descendant of both of them. She is described as coming from an old royal family, and her soul can be transmuted into the smoothing sunlight miracle, a miracle that once belonged to Guinevere. Although we do know Guinevere would later marry into the Lothric royal family, it's unknown what became of her husband Flan, as the Ring of the Sun Princess is the only item that mentions him. Ash Lake's skull identity. When we traverse through the ominous shores of Ash Lake, we can stumble across a giant skull. Now, there are so many different theories regarding the identity of this thing. Some say it's the skull of a giant, an asylum demon, a dragon, or possibly a nameless blacksmith deity. Although any one of these could be true, we'll sadly never get an answer to its true identity. Ornstein was an illusion. All the way back in Layer 1, I mentioned how Smough murders Ornstein. However, Smough might have killed Ornstein not out of malice, but because he knew the Ornstein that was with him was just an illusion. When we attacked Guinevere, we discovered that not only she was an illusion, but Anor Londo as well, including most of its enemies. So the Ornstein we fight might have been an illusion created by Gwendolyn. To add on to this, in Dark Souls 3, when we revisit Anor Londo, we can find Smough's hammer, and it states how he was the last knight to guard Anor Londo before Aldrich took over. And later on, after we defeat the Nameless King, we can find Ornstein's armor, not on a corpse, but left a scar on the ground. So here's what might have happened. Before the events of the game, Ornstein left his post to search for the Nameless King, Gwyn's firstborn son, but before he left, he might have given Gwendolyn a piece of his soul to cast an illusion in his place. But as time passed, Anor Londo would fall into ruins, and it was made worse when Aldrich took over and devoured Gwendolyn, and most likely Smough as well, the last knight to remain as post. Meanwhile, Ornstein would find his way to Archdragon Peak and to the Nameless King. However, Ornstein's story runs into a dead end here. Although we find his armor here, we don't truly know what happened to him. However, there's two popular theories that could explain his fate. The first one is Ornstein might have become one of the meditating dragons we find across the map, going from the famous Dragon Slayer to now wanting to embrace the way of them. Speaking of which, the second theory is kind of a stretch, but Ornstein could become the storm drake the Nameless King flies on. Although Ornstein's fate is left to interpretation, it does look like he finally reunited with his long-lost master. Sif experiments on Gwendolyn. Dark Sun Gwendolyn was born male, but was raised a female by his father Gwyn due to his affinity with the moon. But another interesting detail about Gwendolyn is he has snakes where his legs should be. People have speculated that this may be due to Sif experimenting on him. Snakes in Dark Souls are often associated with dragons, so Sif might have experimented on Gwendolyn, giving him the snake legs, possibly an attempt to change Gwendolyn's sex to female by replacing his bottom half, and to give him dragon-like powers to enhance his sorceries. Ceaseless Discharge is the son of the witch and blacksmith deity. Yeah, unfortunately with this one, it's pure headcanon. I couldn't find any substantial evidence that the nameless blacksmith deity fathered Ceaseless, or anything coming close. It could be true, but unfortunately there's nothing to back it up. Sealer and Lortrek's party. When New Londo was flooded, there were 3 sealers who watch over the city to prevent the 4 kings from escaping. However, when we travel through New Londo, we find only one of them, that being Ingward. But we do know what happened to the other sealers. One of them went to Blighttown to provide healing to its residents, but unfortunately met their demise. And the third one joined Lortrek's party, probably upset with the god's decision to flood New Londo that killed countless civilians, so they joined Lortrek in his own mission against the gods. Islith Unbreakable Illusory Wall. I couldn't really find anything about an unbreakable illusory wall in Lost Islith. However, the closest I can find is a hidden bonfire that's found an illusory wall in Islith. This entry could be talked about that, but if you guys know any more about this, please let me know in the comments. Lortrek planned to kill Guinevere. When we free Lortrek from his cell, he moves the Firelink and sits across from the Firekeeper, Anastasia. However, when we ring the final bell of awakening, Lortrek kills Anastasia and runs off to Anor Londo, where we can invade his world and kill him to bring Anastasia back to life. But this raises 2 questions. What were Lortrek's motives for killing Anastasia, and what was he doing in Anor Londo? I briefly mentioned this in the Sealer entry, but Lortrek could be on a mission to dismantle the Way of Light and the gods. By killing Anastasia, he's dismantling the Firelink bonfire and preventing Chosen Undead from using it. Furthermore, when you invade him, he's outside Ornstein and Smough's arena with 2 others. Lortrek could be here to take on Ornstein and Smough and get to Guinevere and put an end to the shepherding of the undead. Although Lortrek may have his own motives, let's be honest, he's still up for disabling Firelink's bonfire. Quaylana's true motives. Quaylana is one of the daughters of the Witch of Islith, and once the player has a +10 pyromancy flame, she'll spawn in Blighttown and be able to teach the player pyromancies. However, Quaylana will then ask the player to kill her sisters and mother, not out of evil, but to end her family's suffering. This is probably why she only spawns when the player has a +10 pyromancy flame, so she can find someone strong enough to help her suffering family. Rhea is Havel's daughter. When we confront Petrus for abandoning Rhea in her party, he mentions how she's only wore her family's name. While Great Clips tells us that Rhea comes from a noble family, and people have theorized that she might be Havel's daughter. Havel, the dragon-slaying warrior, was also a bishop for the Way of White, and Havel might have fallen in love with and had a child with one of the Way of White priestesses. However, due to the controversy this would cause, the young Rhea was sent off to be raised as a cleric. This also might explain why she can be kidnapped to the Duke's archives, so Sif can get back at Havel by kidnapping his daughter. However, besides what Great Clips tells us, we don't really know who Rhea's family truly is. Killing bosses as a White Phantom lowers Sunbro faith requirements. Wow, that was a mouthful. But yeah, the Warriors of Sunlight is only joinable if the player has 25 or more faith. But if you help out other players in boss fights, it lowers their faith requirement by 5. I love this detail, because the game rewards you by helping out other players. Now everyone, we only got 2 layers to this iceberg left, so without wasting any more time, let's make our way to layer 7. Black Knights guard areas related to the plot against the gods. This entry is kind of a stretch, but the Black Knights we encounter could be guarding areas related to the plot against the gods. The night we find the Undead Berg is close to where Havel's Bridge used to be. The knight closest to the gargoyles is on top of a tower, possibly overlooking areas the plotters might attack. There's 2 knights in the catacombs, where the plotters attempted to steal the Rye of Kindling from Nito, and another 2 in the Undead Asylum, where we can find a peculiar doll, an item that allows access to the Painted World, a realm that the gods store away anything that poses a threat to them. And the knight in Darkroot who guards over his shield. Yeah, I couldn't really find a good explanation for him. Although these knights could be guarding areas related to the plot against the gods, I couldn't find evidence that they are, but it's left up to you guys to believe this or not. Vamos on the FG shield. If we look close at the FG shield, the helmet on it bears a striking resemblance to the royal helm Vamos has, and considering the shield is found not far from where Vamos resides, Vamos himself could be the face on the shield. Although this could be true, the face on the shield is missing the weird tentacle beard Vamos has, so the face on the shield could be someone else from Vamos' alleged royal line. Corinthian ring pattern on Smelling Gwyn's armor. If we look at Smelling Gwyn's armor, we can see flower patterns and motifs across them, very similar to the Chloranthy ring. It's heavily speculated that the Nimbus blacksmith deity is the one who created the Chloranthy ring, and armor sets for Gwyn and Smo, using flowers as inspiration for their designs. Jeremiah fell in love with Fina. I already went over this back in Layer 4, but to recap, it's implied Jeremiah cheated on the Witch of Islip due to his crown being able to betray snugly for a ring of favor and protection, a ring worn by followers of the goddess Fina. Outside of her husband cheating on him, Jeremiah is banished to the Painted World, or turned to a squid monster. Pick your poison. Prince Rickard is a double agent. What I believe this entry is talking about is Prince Rickard could have been sent by the gods to infiltrate Havel and his plotters. Rickard is stated to have come from royalty, and he guards a tower containing a hidden blessing, possibly attaining it from his royal background, and a rare ring of sacrifice, and now that'll be very effective in countering Sif's curse attacks. Now Rickard could have been working for either side. He might have used his royal connections to feed info to the plotters, or it might have been feeding the gods' troop movements or positions of the plotters. But what we do know is something happened at Sin's Fortress, because if we look at the Iron Golem's arena, we can see a ruined path to Aerolundo. Maybe Rickard tricked the plotters to come to Sin's Fortress, but cut them off from Aerolundo and trapped them there. Sadly, we'll likely never know what truly went on here. Stone Dragon was a Sif experiment. We all know how Sif desires to find true immortality, and he believes bringing the ancient dragons back to life could lead him to replicate their immortal scales for his own use. However, Sif might have already reached this goal. The stone dragon of Ash Lake could have been brought to life by Sif. The dragon is found in a hollowed tree in Ash Lake, guarded by a hydra and giant clams that can be found outside Sif's arena. If this dragon was created by Sif, then his egg was likely birthed from one of the Basakas. However, we don't truly know if Sif knows about the stone dragon's existence. If he did, he'll likely have more of his golems and channelers guarding Ash Lake, or at least some kind of item description implying a connection. Alright everyone, we've come a long way, but it's time for us to dive into the final layer of this iceberg, Layer 8. Iados is a crystal knight. According to the Avalon item description, it's said to be made by the weapon craftsman Iados. So you might be asking, what's this have to do with the Crystal Knight? Well, in an interview with Miyazaki, he states how he had to put the Avalon in the Duke's archives, in the same location we find the Crystal Knight. So it's very likely Iados might be the Crystal Knight we fight right before we encounter Sith. Siegmeyer knows he's in a video game. Yeah, sadly, the closest thing I could find to this entry when doing research is a joke theory from Reddit. But what I think this entry might be talking about is Siegmeyer always seems to be stuck or has some sort of roadblock in front of him. Instead of attempting to solve these problems himself, he knows the player will come by and help him out. So he waits for the player to come by and solve his problems for him. At least that's what I think. Who knows, maybe Siegmeyer does think he's in a video game. Siegmeyer's wife is the blue tearstone corpse. The blue tearstone ring is used to raise the defenses of its user when they're close to death. Now, there is a pretty crazy theory that the corpse the blue tearstone ring is found on is Siegmeyer's wife. How we know this? Well, the ring originates from Katarina, and that's it. Besides the ring originating from Katarina, there's nothing else suggesting the corpse is Siegmeyer's wife's. It's like seeing a lost treasure being discovered down the street from me as mine because I live in the same town as it. That's basically what this theory amounts to. Yulia's identity. The merchant we can trade with in Undead Berg is always mentioning someone by the name of Yulia. However, he does not explain who this individual is. People speculate Yulia might be the female undead merchant we can find inside the Firelink Bridge. However, he could be referring to the katana he carries, or possibly the bucket he periodically pats. So Yulia can be a lot of different things, but what I believe the true Yulia is the friends we made along the way. Nito and Love. When entering Neo's arena, we can find a giant coffin he rests in. However, there's also a smaller coffin next to his. Could this coffin belong to someone Nito cares for? Perhaps a lover? Sadly, despite Nito being one of the major bosses in the intro and having his own covenant, we basically know next to nothing about him. So sadly, we'll likely never know who this coffin truly belongs to. It's pronounced Smoth, not Smo. This discussion is as old as the game itself. People have argued over how to properly pronounce Smo's name. Some say Smo, like myself, while others pronounce his name Smoth. This is likely due to Goff having the O-U-G-H in his name, and his name being pronounced Goff and not Go. But who really knows how it's pronounced? Teach your own, I guess. Smo, Smoth, tomato, tomato, Equaza, Equaza. Dark Souls helps treat depression. Okay, you guys might think I'm crazy for this one. How does a brutally difficult game like Dark Souls help people with depression? Well, this goes without saying, I am by no means any sort of doctor or licensed physician, but there's been multiple studies over the years and so many different personal accounts on how Dark Souls has helped people overcome their depression, and has even stopped some from taking their own lives. And although accounts vary, it's mainly because how difficult a game Dark Souls is. It doesn't hold your hand, and it will punish you if you make mistakes. It's because of the game's brutal nature that resonates with people who struggle with mental health. Having to fight a boss and die over and over again until you finally succeed is a way to build someone's patience, resilience, and confidence in themselves. And the process of going hollow can be seen as an allegory for depression. An undead doesn't go hollow when they die, they only hollow once they've lost their purpose in life. And every NPC you meet tells you the same line, don't you dare go hollow. And the only NPC that says he will ends up going hollow after seeing how much you've accomplished. This is why I love this game so much. Although I've never been depressed myself, knowing how much this game has impacted so many different people's lives and has uplifted people from really dark places has always resonated with me. In a way, you can see Dark Souls as real life. Both are brutally difficult to navigate through and are not easy, but the only way to make it through is to try over and over again until you finally succeed. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for the final entry to this Iceberg, every version of Dark Souls is personal. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. This took me a super long time to make, and it's definitely the longest video I've worked on. But I did have a fun time making this, and getting to enjoy the game series I love. And if you guys are longtime viewers of mine, then this video seems pretty out of the ordinary, due to my other videos being gameplay focused. But to tell you guys the truth, I'm pretty burnt out when it comes to trying to get good at competitive games, especially how all of my favorite ones have fallen off. Siege still has a horrendous cheating issue, and has devs who are way too incompetent and lazy to fix their game. Rivals is an unbalanced mess that has a rigged matchmaking system, and athlete punishes the player for playing the game in long sessions. And although I dipped my toes a bit into Overwatch and had some fun with it, it still shares some of the same issues as Rivals, just in a less chaotic way. So, after I installed Rivals a couple months back, I decided to pick up and play the original Dark Souls again, and rediscover my love for the series. In Dark Souls, all my actions aren't dictated by teammates, matchmaking, the meta, or any of that. It's just me and my own skill against the game, and that's what makes me happy. Each victory feels rewarding, and each death, with some exceptions, doesn't feel like a bad teammate let me down or a rigged algorithm, but mistakes I've made that I can learn and grow from. Playing Dark Souls again made me realize I'd rather pursue something that will bring me happiness over chasing glory that makes me feel hollow. But enough of my rambling. I really hope you guys enjoy this video, and now I'm going to start working on Dark Souls 2 Iceberg, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Anyways, as always, love y'all, and peace, and remember, don't you dare go hollow.